can see you as you log on, and I see a lot of people I know. I just wanted to begin with a few disclaimers. The first is it didn't dawn on me until yesterday that this is the EBM Tools Network, not the Marine EBM Tools Network. And if you know me, you know that I work in the field of coastal and marine policy, and so I'm going to provide all of the examples today that I do will be from marine and coastal policy perspective, but I think you'll find that they apply to EBM generally. The second disclaimer is that I have put this talk together really thinking about non-economists, and so I see some economist friends here who've logged on. You'll have to sort of forgive me for oversimplifying some concepts in order to get through this, but I'm really thinking about what it is the non-economist needs to know. And what I'll be talking about today is, in large part, my opinion and perspective, having been an academic environmental economist for about 15 years and then spending another 5 years working in policy more generally and trying to convey these economic ideas and concepts to people who may either think they know what we're talking about and in fact don't, or may feel like they are hopelessly lost when we start talking about economics. So that's where I'm going to be coming from. The final disclaimer is I'm giving this webinar from a hotel room in Washington, D.C., so if you hear someone shout housekeeping, don't be alarmed. Let's see here. Okay, so I want to start off by talking about economic valuation because it seems that everyone I talk to is interested now in perhaps doing economic valuation for the ecosystem that they work in. I've done a lot of work over the past decade with the National Ocean Economics Program, and by far the biggest demand that the National Ocean Economics Program has felt for data and information has been on the non-market side. So I just want to talk a little bit about economic valuation, and I want to start by pointing out that economic value to economists is something that may be quite distinct to other people in society. And so when economists think about economic value, we're really thinking about how much better off is society because we have access to a resource, or we're able to use an ecosystem for an ecosystem service, or we may not even use it. We may place a value on simply knowing that it exists. But it's this idea that it is the increase in value that society experiences by having this resource. And it really is broken down into thinking about what would society be willing to pay if they had to enjoy the existence of some ecosystem service, for instance. And what does it cost to produce that good? So for instance, if we're talking about the value of recreational fishing, it's the value, what would the recreational fisher be willing to pay, minus the costs of having to drive to the shore and perhaps pay for a charter hire. And if it turns out that in order to have that ecosystem service or that experience, you also have to provide some public good like a marine protected area, we also want to be thinking about what the costs are for providing that public management. If you're familiar with supply and demand curves, here's one that is just happens to be for snapper, red snapper, and of course the red line is the demand curve, and it represents how much society would be willing to pay, for instance, for each snapper consumed if you had to pay as you consumed each snapper, and it's a downward sloping curve that indicates eventually we only consume so much snapper, and after that point we may not want more. The supply curve, on the other hand, represents how much it costs to bring those snappers to the market. And if we do have a market for snapper, then the market will equilibrate supply and demand, and we end up trading snapper on the market for this price P. Now, P is not the value, even though it's something that we focus on a lot in economics. We're interested in what the price is for ecosystem services that are sold in the market. But it's the area under that red line that represents the total willingness to pay for that particular ecosystem service, snapper. And then the area under the supply curve up to that point where we supply snapper in the market represents how much it costs. So from society's perspective, it's the areas A and B that represent how much more we're willing to pay for that snapper than it costs us C. And so that value is shared in a marketed good between people that get to enjoy snapper, so that's the area A, and of course they have to pay the price, so they don't enjoy that, but the producer enjoys that, and so that's the area B. So we have consumer surplus A and producer surplus B, and that's sort of a very quick and general take on what would be the value of a marketed good. Now, often we don't have to pay for that, and so we are looking at different ways of estimating the area under that willingness to pay curve. Now, as a point of fact, we're much better at estimating the small changes in those areas A and B. So small changes in the value we place on, say, access to a resource, whether it means losing some access or gaining some access, or it may be relatively small changes in the quantities of an ecosystem services that we have available, say the number of fish or the number of days that you are able to go fishing, or the change in quality. We don't often do a very good job of measuring the entire value of something. That's how much would we lose if we lost all of a resource. Even though we do this, and I have been guilty of this in the past, and we do it because we're trying to give people a ballpark idea of what the value of a resource might be if it's not marketed directly. But I want to point out that most of the work we do, we have much more confidence in our ability to measure these sort of what we call marginal changes in the abundance or access or quality of ecosystem services. This is important though, and it's helpful because it lets us try to weigh trade-offs that we have to make as part of ecosystem-based management. So we may, for instance, be thinking about restoring a habitat, and we can't have it all, so certain types of restoration may lead to having more bird life at the expense of having more fish life. And we want to know, for instance, how does society benefit from having more birds and fewer fish, or vice versa? We can think about this from an EBM perspective as what kind of ecosystem are we managing for? And we make it ecosystems that produce different kinds of habitats. So, for instance, in Elkhorn Slough in California, restoration there is really weighing the trade-offs of, do we want to let tidal scouring increase the amount of deep areas we have at the loss of expanses of mudflats or maybe salt marsh. And having that trade-off between deep water and mudflats really translates into having different kinds of ecosystem services that are coming from that estuary. So in the case of Elkhorn Slough, it really comes down to the difference between having more otters or more wading birds. Where do we want to go, and how do we value having more otters or more wading birds? It may also translate directly into differences in uses of the estuary. So once again, with the deep water versus mudflat example in Elkhorn Slough, when we have deep water, it gives us more areas for kayaking and fishing, but fewer places to see shorebirds that like those mudflats. So what we want to do then in thinking about valuation is how really does this value of kayaking compare to the value of bird watching? Can we think of this in some kind of monetized way? And when I say monetized, it doesn't mean how much people are spending on kayaking versus how much they're spending on bird watching. It's this value to society. How much better off are we because we have more kayaking or more bird watching? And when I talked about the fact that we do a good job of valuing small changes, what that means is that as a point of fact, we really don't have data along this entire curve, if any at all. We often know about a much smaller section of this curve. Because if we look at Elkhorn Slough, for instance, we can't imagine, or we haven't collected data on the case where we have zero bird watching and lots of kayaking. And the opposite's true, where we have no kayaking and lots of bird watching. So we're often left with data and analysis from part of this curve, and our EBM may push us outside of that curve. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about valuations. What is it that we can value? Okay. Now, there are lots of trade-offs that we can be talking about. It could be something like fish speared versus fish watched by scuba divers or snorkelers. Habitat developed versus habitat protected. In New England, most recently we've been talking about things like shipping time versus injured right whales. So is it worth it to force ships to go slow and take longer in order to protect right whales that may be in those channels? Personal watercraft and tranquility, or if you're familiar with forest uses in colder places, it could be snowmobiling versus cross-country skiing. And more generally, we think about this when we're weighing how much money we should be spending doing ecosystem-based management versus other public policies that we could implement with that money. Okay, so we have value in kayaking, for instance, and bird watching, but we also recognize that when we do things like manage for certain kinds of habitat, that could affect the willingness to pay and the value that's associated with fishing. And then that may also affect other things like scuba diving, and eventually you realize that we have too many dimensions to model this simply. And that's where some of the newer models are coming in that attempt to manage ecosystem services. And so I've listed just two here, the Natural Capital Project and the MIMES project. One on the MIMES project is out of the University of Vermont, and the Natural Capital Project is out of a number of places. Both of these models are attempts to get a handle on more than a simple two-dimensional view of the world. The important thing to remember with these models, of course, is that the output of the models is only as good as the input of the models. And so these models require that we have the kind of information on the trade-offs and the values that I've discussed before. One of the my warnings is that we find that we tend to be more interested and more excited about creating models than we are about collecting the sort of blue-collar data that we need to go into these models. And so we have to do both at the same time. And I encourage anyone who's working in ecosystem-based management to think really hard about what kind of data we need to better inform these models. Now, there are some things that you should consider when you're thinking about whether you want to do evaluation and how you're going to use the valuation data. I've talked about the fact that we're much better at estimating the value of small changes in ecosystems rather than really, really big changes. And sometimes ecosystem-based management really does mean making big changes. And so we may be limited in our ability to value that at least beforehand. It's important to remember that the values that people place on ecosystem services depend on lots of things beyond the ecosystem services in question. And these values can change for reasons well beyond ecosystem-based management. They could change because of population change, because of demographic change, because of quality changes that may be caused by pollution, things that may be out of our control or maybe are just coming into our control. But we need to recognize that these values are affected by a number of different factors. It's also important to recognize that there are some things that are more difficult to value. And so when we think about doing a valuation study, we need to think about whether we're going to be successful in doing that. One of the issues that I've encountered quite frequently is it's very difficult to estimate the profit portion of that value. So that would be the area B. What's the value that accrues to people who provide these services or at least access to these services? Sometimes this information is proprietary, and so we may be able to estimate the value to the consumer, but we often run into trouble valuing the profit side, what we call producer surplus. It may be difficult to estimate the willingness to pay for certain ecosystem services, especially if people are not used to seeing those things or enjoying those ecosystem services if they're out of their range of experience. And of course, when we change ecosystems, when we do ecosystem-based management, it's rarely the case that a single ecosystem service changes and everything else stays equal. We tend to have changes in lots of services all at once, and we have to try to value these changes simultaneously. Now, that's not to say we can't do these things. We can. It's just you need to recognize that there's this increasing complexity of valuation that's required in some cases. Another thing that's important to remember when we're thinking about using economic valuation data is who benefits, who gets the value. So I see frequently people working in places where there's a lot of international tourism. They calculate the consumer surplus of tourism without asking the question, so if you are Belize or Bonaire or Panama, why do you really care about the consumer surplus of these international visitors? You know, what is it that you want to do when you value this? Is it because you're trying to show the international community that this resource has value? Is it because you're trying to capture more of that value? What is it? So it's very important to recognize who gets this value when you're doing the valuation study. If you're interested in figuring out what the local value of a resource is, and most of the users are not local, you may not want to do a valuation study. And then finally, this is I think the frustrating thing for a lot of economists. We know that value is the right metric for understanding how ecosystem services and changes in those ecosystem services brought about by policy actions affect society. But the fact of the matter is that there's still a lot of people who make policy who don't buy into this concept of value beyond price times quantity. They understand revenue, they understand spending, but they don't quite get value. And so we often have to be aware that if we go into a situation where we're trying to convey the value of something as estimated through a valuation study, and the policymakers don't buy it, we may not have really achieved much. Part of getting people to understand value is to understand the fact that one of the reasons that we want to use economics is because economics tells a story. Economics is just another way of communicating how the world changes because of ecosystem-based management. And it's important to remember the story we're trying to tell. At the very minimum, the story is, why bother with ecosystem-based management in the first place? We have a long history in environmental policy of trying to convince people that we're doing this because it's the right thing to do. But more people want to know, well, is it the economically right thing to do? We also, in telling the story, need some way of demonstrating who may benefit from ecosystem-based management and how exactly would they benefit. What's the mechanism? What is it that they are consuming or enjoying that may benefit from ecosystem-based management, and how does that then improve their economic well-being? In some cases, especially if we're trying to curtail what we consider to be harmful behavior, somebody might lose, and it's important to be thinking about what's the economic impact of people who may come out on the losing side of ecosystem-based management. So we can put that loss in the perspective of these potential benefits. And is it worth it? Is it worth it financially? That is, we're investing this money. If the money is coming from a local community, the local community needs to know it's going to get it back. Is it worth it economically? And that really gets at, is the world a better place with ecosystem-based management? And it's not just, does ecosystem-based management have a greater than zero net value to society, but how does investing in ecosystem-based management compare to other things we could have done with that money? Doing non-ecosystem-based environmental management, building schools, improving educational literacy, etc. So part of this is figuring out initially who your audience really is, and that matters. And so in my work, most recently, my audience really has fallen out into these groups here. OMB, if you're not from the United States, is the Office of Management and Budget. They are in some sense, one of the more powerful agencies in the U.S. federal government because they decide how money gets spent and what kinds of bars we need to meet or exceed in order to keep getting money to spend on certain programs. Congress, of course, is another audience, and we talk to Congress in a much different way than we talk to OMB. State and federal agencies, they have their own issues and their own needs. Our local partners on the ground have certain things that they want to know about, funders, and of course there are people whose behavior we want to change. And all of these audiences are interested in different aspects of economic value and impacts. One of the things that we've seen is that in many, many cases, the economic information that the politicians want to know and that people at the local level want to know is how is this going to affect jobs, revenues, and taxes. These are things that we call economic impact, not economic value. They are important. They're important politically. They're important locally, especially if, as I mentioned earlier, all of the values going offshore to international tourists, what you may be interested in as well, how many jobs are created here, what are the revenues that are created, are we earning any taxes off this? They're easy to measure, they tell a good story, but it's important to remember that these measures of economic impact, jobs, revenues, and taxes, have no direct relationship. There's no one-to-one relationship between jobs and spending to economic value. So for instance, Bonaire may bring in $30 million a year in scuba diving tourism, but if it costs $29,900,000 to run that tourism industry, then the net value is just a tiny sliver, $100,000 say. There's no relationship, direct relationship between revenues and jobs and value. I have this book up here, Economic Analysis for Ecosystem-Based Management by Dan Holland and Jim Sankirko and Robin Deepak. It's a terrific book, and there's a great page in there trying to explain this seemingly contrary idea that a job created is not necessarily a benefit for society. So I encourage you to take a look at that book. I was so impressed by the write-up of this impact versus values that I used as an appendix in a recent Blue Ribbon panel document to know about measuring the economic value of habitat restoration. And this book I think is good for people doing EBM generally. It really hits all the bases on thinking about a proper economic analysis for ecosystem-based management. When we're talking about Congress and agencies and local partners, the conversation begins at who are the constituents, who are the users, and who are the beneficiaries. And in the coastal world, you'd be surprised at how little we know about who are the people who benefit from coastal ecosystem goods and services. We tend to focus on the sectors where we've collected data. So when people talk about marine economies and coastal economies in the United States, we talk a lot about fishing and a lot about tourism. And that's in part because we have data on these things and we can measure the amount of money that they're bringing in the market. But it becomes very difficult to talk about how many people are living in the coastal zone, how much of their decision to live there depends on their ability to enjoy these local ecosystem services, how many are watching birds and going surfing. So a lot of collecting economic information is just collecting economic data on who these users are and what economic decisions they're making that really depend on the quality and abundance of ecosystem services. A lot of times what Congress wants to know, what international agencies want to know is how big is the ecosystem-dependent economy, and how much of that is at risk because we're not doing EBM or we're not doing it right. What happens if we fail to protect coral reefs? What happens if we let salt marshes die? Who does that affect? part of getting at this is coming up with better measures of human use generally. And I described that when I was talking about constituents. But who uses the ecosystem? How many people are going bird watching? How many homes are there in the coastal zone? How many recreational anglers? How many boats and ships are coming through? Any measures we can get that start giving us a better idea of who these users are is one step down the road in getting better economic information about these uses. And understanding the geography of use is particularly important. It's often perceived incorrectly that the only people who benefit from these coastal ecosystems, for instance, are people who live nearby. Now, I think we all know that to the degree that coastal ecosystems provide carbon sequestration, the whole world benefits. And there are all sorts of ecosystem functions that accrue to people well away from the ecosystem. But even direct ecosystem uses benefit people that live far away. We know in the United States, for instance, that 1 in every 2 adults will make a trip to the coast each year for recreational purposes. That's why people in Kansas should care about the way the ecosystem is managed in Virginia. And that's also true in places like Indonesia, with people coming from other islands and people coming from Australia. So understanding not only where it is that people enjoy these ecosystem services, but where they live, because they have a stake in this too, and it's not just locals. Ultimately, though, what we're finding now is people are starting to ask the hard question, which is, did ecosystem-based management make a difference, and can you prove it? And so it is OMB in the United States that's starting to put pressure on agencies, and particularly the OMB examiner at a couple of offices at NOAA has really started asking the tough questions. And what they've asked basically is they said, you know, for the last 20 years, you've said when you do habitat restoration, it benefits local economies. Now prove it. And so that proof is not a valuation study that predicts what the outcome might have been. That proof is you've got to show somehow that the ecosystem-based management policies that you've implemented, whether it's restoration or all of the policies together, how have people's values and uses changed because of your ecosystem-based management? The URL I have up here is a link to a report by the Blue Ribbon Panel looking at ways of measuring the economic value of restoration projects. But I think the recommendations in there speak pretty well to the way we need to be thinking about collecting data so we can start demonstrating what the economic impact of EBM is once we've implemented it. Like I mentioned before, it's not just does EBM have a net positive impact, but how big is this impact and how does it compare with other ways that we can spend that money? And for OMB, it's how can we spend federal dollars in the most efficient way? And so OMB wants to know, is EBM achieving its goals? And one of those goals is how does it affect human uses? Okay. We're also interested, if we're interested in adaptive management, in understanding what's the world like with EBM and what's the world like without EBM. And we hope that by doing EBM, we're improving values and the value of use. The real question is, in some cases, does EBM change the behavior of people or the way people use ecosystems or the values that we place on it? And to be able to answer that question, what we find is that we really need a baseline. We have to start collecting data so that when we implement policies, we have a baseline to compare behavior and value after the fact with before the fact. And it can't just be in places where we've implemented a policy. We need it, of course, in places that have our policy and places that don't have our policy, with EBM and without EBM, with marine protection and without marine protection, and before or after. And as I mentioned in one of the first slides, we have to recognize that use and economic value may change quite apart from anything that you did as a policymaker. So it It may be that value has changed, but EBM didn't have anything to do with it. It could also be that value doesn't change, but EBM made the value better than it would have been without EBM. This is sort of the big debate that's happening right now in the United States with the stimulus money. Well, was the economy better off with or without the stimulus? The hard part about assessing that is we have the with and without, but we don't, I mean, we have the before and after, but we don't have the with and without because we generally applied the stimulus across the board. Now, one way of thinking about getting these baseline data and data with and without is to come up with ways of collecting data that are easier than doing economic valuations. And so these are called economic indicators. And economic indicators are measures that we can make that have some direct relationship to value, whether it's the number of visitor days that are taken, the number of visitors. Sometimes we can look at complementary purchases. So these are things that if you want a fish and the fish only eat worms, you've got to buy worms. If you're interested in knowing something about how surfing changes, if we could only measure the amount of surf wax sold locally, we'd have a pretty good idea of how surfing activity is changing. It's very difficult to measure surfers. They get up early, but there may be other things that we can measure. So we've been spending more time trying to think about different kinds of indicators of use and value that we can collect before we do policy, after we do policy, with and without. And the important thing about these indicators is that if we're trying to figure out what the effects of EBM have been, we need to make sure that we try to collect data in a consistent methodology over time, that is before, during, and after the implementation of a policy, and also with and without. And this seems contrary to a lot of people. We need to be collecting data where we're not implementing our policies in order to know what the effects of the policies have been. So to be useful, these data, these indicators need to be collected regularly, and they need to be collected at many places. Now we take these economic indicators of use and we mix them with ecological indicators and explanatory factors, and we can start saying something about why did these values change? Why did these uses change? And was it because of a change in the ecosystem or a change in something else? And so in addition to indicators of economic use and value, we need economic indicators of things in the environment and the ecosystem that are important to people. That is, we need to focus on water quality measures that people understand and they may respond to if we're going to try to come up with a relationship. So in California, for instance, they use beach grades. Heal the Bay has beach grades that are based on fecal indicator bacteria, but when we've studied the way beach going is affected by changes in water quality, it turns out that the average annual beach grade is a much better explanatory variable than how much fecal indicator bacteria was measured on a day-to-day basis. So there are lots of ways of characterizing the ecosystem. It is not always the case, in fact it's rarely the case, that the kind of ecological indicators that we collect regularly as part of our ecosystem-based management are the ecological factors that are most important in understanding economic behavior and use. Things that are important to human use could be things like water quality, fish abundance and size, number of birds, number of species of birds, acres of open water if we're talking about an estuary, trash on the beach. These are things that are important to people and help us understand the changes in values, but they're not necessarily the things that biologists may think of when trying to measure the ecosystem. And then in addition, we have to be able to measure other explanatory factors, things that could have changed the value or the economic use that really didn't have anything to do with our policy. Things like changes in the economy. Change in the cost of travel may say a lot about why ecosystem use is changing. Changes in access. Was the road closed? Was the beach closed? Demographic change. People's preferences for ecosystem services and how they use the ecosystems may change with demographic changes. It can change with age. It can change with ethnicity, with religion. There are a number of social and sociological factors that could be responsible. And even things like weather, if we're talking about recreation, might be important. So we want a way of kind of linking these ecological factors that we're trying to change with ecosystem-based management, these background explanatory factors, with these economic values and economic uses. So what I want to do is just talk very quickly about the example of the restoration of a coastal lagoon in California. This is the lagoon at Zuma Beach in Malibu, California. On the left, what you see here is that Zuma Lagoon was really the end of a storm drain. It wasn't a lagoon, it was a fetid, stinking pool. And it was restored. It was dug out. Local salt marsh grasses were planted. Willows were planted up and down the waterway. And what we had is we went from a storm drain to this lovely area that was full of birds, full of grasses. And the question is, okay, well, we spent this money doing the restoration. Did it make any difference to people? Okay. One more shot of the restoration. Well, if we just look at the policy site, we're fortunate in that we have beach attendance data that's been collected for this beach for a period of roughly 10 years when I did the analysis. And the restoration occurred right there in the middle. And you can see that it's difficult just looking at this set of data, attendance for this one beach, whether this restoration is responsible for any change in attendance after the restoration. That's because we don't know what was going on in the rest of the world. Well, in fact, we do know what was going on in the rest of a small part of the world, and that is we have attendance data from 25 other beaches in that Santa Monica Bay area. If we look at beach attendance in these other beaches, we see that beach attendance was declining pretty regularly during that same period at all of these other beaches, and was more or less staying the same at Zuma. So that starts to give us an idea that, well, if beach attendance isn't declining at Zuma, maybe it was because of the restoration. But we need to be able to rule out other factors. And so what we were able to do is we collected this beach visitation data for these 26 years. We have 10 years of data, and this is enough to let us start doing an analysis. Okay? But we have to recognize other things were happening at the same time. There was a process to start diverting storm drains generally up and down the coast. And you can see on the left, this is what the Pico-Kenter storm drain looks like when it isn't diverted. This is what it looks like when it is diverted. That possibly is a factor that could explain what's going on with beach attendance at Zuma and other places. But it also could be weather, it could be access to Zuma. So we collected data on all of these things, and what we wanted to analyze was, how does beach visitation change? So this is a model, it's like a panel data model of the changes in beach visitation as a function of this restoration event at Zuma, these storm drain diversions that occurred up and down the 26 beaches over that period of time, and then these other explanatory factors. So we have a lot of factors here for rain, whether it was raining at the beach, whether it was a warm day at the beach, or probably just as important, what was the temperature inland where most people came from? How warm was the water? What was water quality like? And how did that change from year to year? These access factors. And when we can control for these explanatory factors, what we find is that we can do an analysis. And in this case, the restoration event that occurred at Zuma had a very significant impact on the number of beachgoers going to Zuma. And what this suggests is that on the order of 1 million more visitor days took place at Zuma Beach relative compared to all the other beaches because of that restoration, or at least after that restoration, controlling for all these other factors. And that these storm drain diversions on average led to roughly 600,000 more visits to beaches that had storm drain diversions. So this is like an epidemiological model in a sense. We try to control for these other factors and see then if our policy intervention seems to have had an impact, whether negative or positive, on particular economic use, in this case, beach visitation. Now, there are many places where we say, well, we just don't have the data. And one of the things that we were pioneering in California, and now it's being used elsewhere, is trying to come up with other ways of measuring coastal uses, in this case. And we turn to internet surveys. And these internet surveys take advantage of the fact that now we have about as many people online regularly as we have had available for random digit phone surveys in the US. And so we can start drawing on these very, very large pools of people to ask them questions about their use of ecosystems, and in this case, coastal ecosystems. In California, we were able to draw from 100,000 internet users and show them Google Maps of the coastline and ask them exactly where they went. So a random sample. They didn't know they were going to be answering these sorts of questions. And we were able to collect 5,000 surveys for about $15 a survey, which is extremely cheap. And we were able to do it for about 300 miles of coastlines. That is, we had areas that were inside and outside of those areas influenced by policy. So it really gives us that baseline that includes with and without, before and after. Well, before and after if we were able to collect it year after year. What the internet survey let people do is look at a map like this and start talking to us, tell us about how they visited and used certain parts of the coast on a yearly basis. And then we were able to ask very detailed questions about their last use. Where did you go on your last trip? And one of the problems we have with large areas is people have difficulty describing exactly where they went with a name. But if they see a map, they're pretty good at pinpointing where they went. By using Google Maps, they were actually able to use the hybrid feature and tell us exactly where we went. Oh yeah, I see that. That's Morro Bay. There's the rock. I went right there. So this was a fun way for them to interact with the survey, but it also let them give us very detailed information about where they used these coastal ecosystems. We collected information about private recreation, all of these different types, and we let people choose among different types because we find that people are not put into little bins about how they use the ecosystem. They tend to use the ecosystem for many different things, including consumptive uses like fishing and different types of fishing. And when we were able to do that, we were able to get a very good picture for the first time in California about who was using these ecosystems beyond commercial fishermen and hotels. And I think it really has started opening our eyes about how people may be benefiting from ecosystem-based management of these marine areas and who these people are in a way that we were never able to do before we did that. Now these kinds of surveys have been applied now in Massachusetts. Chris LaFranchi is working on an application of this in Oregon. So this method is developing relatively quickly, and it's something that can be applied in any place where you have a relatively high concentration of internet use. So to sum up here, moving forward, I think what we're seeing across the board is an increased interest in using economic information. We have nonprofit groups collecting this kind of data. We have federal agencies. We have UNEP. People realize that it's important. But as we're moving into the realm of collecting more economic data, we have to remind ourselves of what data it is that we want to collect and why. Okay. What are we trying to do with this information? And who will be the recipients of this information? When we're doing this, we have to remember that there are certain ecosystem services that provide great economic value and certain ecosystem services that provide only a small amount of economic value. There's certain ecosystem services that cost a lot of money to value and collect data on, and there are certain ecosystem services that are relatively easy. And we have to ask ourselves when we're going out to collect these data, to what degree can we change these values? So the value may be large, but if policy only has the ability to change these values in a very incremental or perhaps insubstantial way, we might not want to spend a lot of time trying to capture those values. I think we really need to think about doing triage on the data we want to collect. And don't forget that if you collect just value data and you haven't collected good data on who's using this, why they accrue this value, where they live, and then what are these other ancillary effects like jobs and taxes, we're telling an incomplete story. And we want to make sure that we have a good story so that people understand and appreciate what these data mean. And I think finally the thing to remember is that we should be collecting data on people, uses, and values as part of any good monitoring program. I went to a conference 2 weeks ago and someone was saying that, you know, the ecosystem reserve system we have in the United States is the sentinel of the impacts of climate change. And I said, okay, well, you're collecting all this great data on salt marshes and how high the sea level is and bird abundance, but are you collecting any data on people? And the answer was no. And if the answer is no, you find yourself in a bind when it comes time to answer the so what question. And that's what people want to know, whether it's at the State House or at the agency or at the taxpayer level. People ultimately want to know, so what? What effect does this have on me? What effect does it have on the economy? What effect does it have on the political constituency I represent? So we need to do a better job of thinking about collecting this socioeconomic data. It's got to be part of our standard monitoring protocol. And with that, I think we can answer questions.
Fantastic. Thank you, Linwood. That was great. And we are starting to get lots of questions in. Again, you can raise your virtual hand and on YouTube, but please only choose that option if you have a working microphone or if you're on the conference call if you've entered your PIN number, or you can type in your question. Let's see. Where should we start? Can you comment on what characteristics make it more or less likely that a data set will be collected over the long term, i.e. it's required by law, it's a professor's pet hobby, etc.?
Well, I think the most important thing is that the data has use for more than one outcome or agency. So what we find is that state parks, for instance, will stop collecting data on visitation if there's a budget crunch because they haven't been sharing the data with anyone else. That's the same thing with lifeguard data. It's the same thing with kayaking. It's the same thing with forest hiking. So to the degree that we have multiple agencies or multiple organizations who have a stake in the data collection, I think it's much more likely to be collected in the long term. It's also got to be cheap to collect and easy to collect in a rigorous way. But you know, once you get these overlapping agencies involved, it becomes relatively cheap. So as an example, in California, the Marine Life Protection Act has given rise to an effort to start collecting data on human uses that may be impacted by this new network of marine protected areas. Well, that same data is going to be useful for understanding how the implementation of Better Clean Water Act policies is, whether it's total maximum daily loads or tertiary sewage treatment or protecting more coastal habitat. All of those things affect the same people that may be affected by marine protected areas. So if the costs of that kind of data collection are shared across agencies, they're shared across counties and municipalities, then the cost of collecting that data becomes much less. And so I think that we're seeing this in the Northeast with the Ecosystem Indicator Partnership. A lot of people will benefit from these data on ecosystem attributes. The same thing is true for these economic indicator data.
Okay, great.
Having a law isn't good enough.
Okay. Thank you, Linwood. Okay, and there was a question, I assume they are looking at thinking about economic questions. Can you speak to data triage and obstacles and opportunities for coastal marine spatial planning in the U.S.? But I guess
Yeah,
let's
so
confine ourselves to think about the economic aspects.
that's right. You know, I think the first thing we hear when people think about economic data for marine spatial planning is, we don't have enough data. It'll take us forever to get enough data on all of the uses of this region. And I think that's the wrong way of thinking about it, because what we usually find is that these spatial planning decisions and decisions about marine protected areas usually come down to understanding the trade-offs in a few areas where there's conflict. Most of the region is without conflict, or without conflict that needs to be resolved with economic information. So I think we need to first start by thinking about, where are the areas where we're going to have to make these trade-off decisions, and what economic information do we have there? And if we don't have good data there, then let's go out and get it. So if we know that we're going to be looking at wind power, and wind power is only feasible in a small part of the regional waters, that's where we need to see where other uses are initially. It's good to have data on other regions for the reasons I described earlier, but in terms of triage, let's start there and see what we have. And then the other thing to remember is that with any of these environmental policies, we're never going to have enough data to do the policy perfectly. The question is, what data do we have now? What decisions can we make based on those data? And do we feel like by making decisions based on these data, we're doing a better job than we would have without considering those data in the first place? We often forget in our search for the perfect that just by doing a better job of using the data we can get our hands on, we're probably going to do a better job than we've been doing.
Okay, great. Another question. Could you discuss the pluses and minuses of an approach such as MIMES, and what alternatives should be considered? For what purposes is something like MIMES a good way to go, and when might another approach be better?
I think the plus of MIMES, or natural capital, is that it lets you understand how these complex ecosystems result in complex changes in economic value and use. And I think that's the only way to think about this, because we can't think about ecosystems as a two-dimensional graph. I think the potential, I won't say downside, but the potential caution with MIMES or natural capital is that most people don't want to look behind the curtain and see what's going on because it's so complicated. And what comes out of it is only as good as what goes into it. And I think that's the risk in any kind of modeling. I think we have to realize that models aren't reality. Models predict the future, but we always need to be looking backwards too and see how well we did. But I think models are very instructive in thinking about the repercussions that policy has across these many different kinds of economic uses and behaviors and values.
Okay, great. Would you recommend the collection of the kind of data you described to help determine whether an environmental restoration project is worth undertaking in the first place?
You know, whether it's worth undertaking in the first place, I think, is usually a political decision, but I think the data are important because you need to understand that there's no such thing as there's not just one kind of restoration. You can restore to pre-Columbian conditions, you can restore to what it was 50 years ago, or you could restore to something new, which may not be restoration, but it's still an alternative. And so the question is, when thinking about this, is where do you want to go with that restoration? Who are the constituents affected? And is that what you want to do with your scarce conservation money?
Okay. Great. There's a couple of housekeeping issues. One, Linwood, could you go back to the slide which had the book? Somebody asked if they wanted to see the author's names again.
Yeah, so the first author's name is Dan Holland.
Okay. And
Okay, is it there?
yeah, you've got it. It was up just a second ago. Yeah, there it is.
There we go. So it's Holland, Sankiriko, Johnston, and I can never remember Deepak's last name, and it's not very clear here.
Okay. But I think you can find it under Holland and the name. So
right.
that should work for them. Okay. And then there was also a question from someone as to whether you could get the slides or the presentation, and the answer is yes, we are recording this, and anybody who wants a link to the recording can shoot me an email at Sarah with an H_Carr@natureserve.org, and I'll make sure you get the link to the recording. It's also available on our website, but I'll send you a note when it's up. Let's see, a number of other questions. The marine renewable energy industry, except wind, is for the most part still on the drawing board. Is it possible to estimate the economic impact of any proposed development, given the paucity of data and no analogous development to draw upon?
So the answer is yes, but the second part of that answer is it depends on how precise we need to be. So we can, I think, certainly start estimating what the ballpark benefit might be and how those compare to the ballpark impacts. So, you know, when we look at something like wind power and we think about what are the potential benefits, we know a lot about what the price of electricity is now and how it might change. We know something about what the scale of environmental negative impacts might be and what the worst case scenario is, and we can use our understanding of economic values to figure out how big those impacts might be compared to the value of reduced energy prices or of not doing as much offshore oil. So we can look at, for instance, what's the worst case scenario of doing deep water drilling now, that we have a worst case scenario. And we can, within a couple of orders of magnitude, compare that to the economic impacts of wind power. And I think this is one of the things that we've got to start doing. We can't, the question isn't, does wind power have a net benefit to society? It's how does it compare to alternative ways of getting energy? And then even when we look at wind power, it's not whether wind power makes sense in Massachusetts. Is should we be doing wind power in Massachusetts or North Carolina? And part of that's also looking at the potential costs and benefits. So even if we don't know to the $1,000 or even to the $1 million, even being able to estimate to the tens of millions of dollars level is going to tell us a lot about whether we should be pursuing these offshore renewable energies.
Okay, thank you, Linwood. Another question, could you speak more to the geographical issue that you raised relating to the value of an ecosystem service as a factor of proximity?
Yeah, so this is particularly true when we think about protecting remote and wild places. We may protect some place that's spectacular biologically and go there and find out that nobody is able to visit because it's so far away, and as a result it has a low use value. Now it may be valued for other things. It may be producing lots of fish that swim far away and are caught someplace else, but we just need to keep in mind where these ecosystem services are being generated and where the potential users are. And it's particularly important, whether we're doing EBM or marine protection, to think about who has to pay for these policies, whether it's going out and implementing better watershed management or protection or foregoing costly development. Somebody has to pay to implement policies, and somebody benefits. So we need to know whether those beneficiaries are the same people who are paying, whether we can transfer some of the benefits they're receiving to the people whose behavior we want to change or who have to pay for this. But it's also just a good thing to keep in mind if you're going to go out and target areas for ecosystem-based management with the idea that doing so is going to be a tool to improve economic conditions, you need to make sure that these are areas that are going to have high economic value in the first place.
Okay. Great. And this question was asked specifically from Malaysia, but I think it might be instructive for a lot of areas. In order to implement an ecosystem-based management of fisheries in Malaysia, what forms of economic indicators are important to set as baseline? Just getting to how would you get started, and they were giving a specific instance of fisheries in Malaysia. Linwood, are you still there? Let's see. Okay. Well, I think we have lost Linwood, so we were just about done anyway. So great. I'd like to thank everyone for attending today. That was a fantastic presentation. We appreciate all the attendees, and we look forward to you attending future webinars. So again, many thanks to Linwood, and I'll pass that along to him. And have a good afternoon, or if you're elsewhere in the world, morning or evening. Okay, bye everyone.